Oh snap, you know what time it is. It's time for Zach and Kristine's Extreme Unit 2 review, starring Kristine Wen and Zachary Ulande, and an extreme review of Unit 2 of Macroeconomics. What is GDP? GDP is an acronym that stands for Gross Domestic Product, which is the total dollar value of final goods and services produced in a given country in a given year, and it measures a country's economic growth. For example, the United States GDP right now is somewhere around $21.3 trillion, which is the highest GDP internationally. Another way of measuring GDP is GDP per capita, which is GDP divided by the total population, and that measures a country's standard of living. Some things to take into account: GDP excludes non-market transactions and illegal activity. It does not measure the quality of goods and services, and it includes products that destroy and harm the environment. There are four components to GDP. There are consumer goods, which we label as C, which account for 70% of the total GDP. There are investment goods, which we label as IG, which account for 15% of the total GDP. There is government spending, which we label as a G, that accounts for 20% of our total GDP. And there is our net exports, which we account for as XN, which accounts for negative 5% of our total GDP. Some items that are not accounted into GDP are used goods, goods not made within that given country, financial transactions, which are things such as stocks and bonds, transfer payments, intermediate goods, which is things such as goods that are used within making a product, so iron, specific tires, things like that. Non-market activity, which is things like DIY projects, fundraising, and black market activity, which again accounts for illegal activities that aren't accurately reported. Thank you, Zach, for that extreme review of GDP.
This is the business cycle. The business cycle is the periodic ups and downs of economic activity.
Just restart.
This is the business cycle. It is the periodic ups and downs of economic activity, and it's typically measured trough to trough. We have the expansion phase. This is when GDP is currently increasing. Even if it's increasing by like 0.01%, it's still expansion. Unemployment starts to decrease. And as we approach the peak is a moment in time. This is when GDP is at its all-time high and unemployment is at an all-time low. Usually the economy is unable to sustain such growth, so it starts to head into the contraction phase. The contraction is when GDP starts to decrease, unemployment starts to increase. And at the trough, this is another moment in time. This is when GDP is at its all-time low and unemployment is at an all-time high. Typically in the trough is when the government starts to lower interest rates so that investment can increase, so that we can start heading back into the expansion phase.
Thank you, Kristine, for that extreme review of the business cycle. Unemployment describes the people in a working labor force that are actively looking for a job but do not have one. So when we talk about our labor force, for example, let's say we have our total population in a given country. The labor force is the individuals in that country that are able to do work, right? And within the labor force, we have our employed and our unemployed, right? And our unemployed, to be unemployed, first of all, you have to not be holding a current job. You have to be able to have a job. You have to be actively looking for a job within the past 4 weeks, right? So whenever we're talking about unemployment, we have our unemployment rate, which is calculated by our unemployed over our working labor force. Times 100. And then that gives you your percentage of unemployed. There are 4 types of unemployment. We have frictional unemployment, which is workers who leave their old jobs but have not found a new job yet. So some examples of that, students who are fresh out of college that are looking for their very first job, people who have left a previous job in search of a higher paying job because they saved up enough money, etc. Our next type of unemployment is structural unemployment. It's when shifts occur in the economy that creates a mismatch in what jobs want of workers and the skills that they have. So some examples of that are when there's new technology introduced to a company, such as machinery or something like that, that replaces the job of a current worker there, and that worker doesn't have the skills to operate that machinery. So they would lose their job, resulting in structural unemployment. Our next type of unemployment is cyclical unemployment, which is the only type of unemployment that is not natural unemployment. It is a resultant of the business cycle. So for example, in a recession, our unemployment rises as people begin to lose their jobs due to certain economic reasons. And finally, we have seasonal unemployment, which is unemployment as a resultant of regular changes in the season. So ski resort workers who lose their job in the summer and spring months, ice cream vendors who don't sell as much in the winter seasons. Lifeguards who lose their jobs in the winter seasons because pools are not open. So those are our 4 types of unemployment, and that is unemployment.
Thank you, Zach, for that extreme review of unemployment.
Inflation. What is inflation? So inflation is a general rise in price levels, which causes our money to be devalued, and our money starts to lose purchasing power. But even though it sounds bad, inflation doesn't hurt everyone. So inflation can benefit borrowers with a fixed interest rate or with no interest rate, but it also harms loaners, people who are saving money, and those on a fixed income. Now we have 4 types of inflation. We have demand pull inflation. This is when you have too much money chasing too few goods. So this is when the total demand for goods and services is way greater than the supply we have. And then we have cost push inflation. This is when the cost of our inputs for our goods and services are increasing, and which causes a rise in prices of our goods and services. We also have fiscal and political inflation. This is when there's excess government spending, and we have hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation isn't that good. It's usually correlated with corrupt countries, like right now Venezuela. This occurs when the government or the country experiences really high and accelerating rates of inflation, and it's usually because there's too much money in circulation and they continue to print more and more money, which causes the money to greatly lose its value. There's also 3 conditions of inflation. You have stagflation. This is when you have high inflation rates but also high unemployment rates, and so the economy is just stagnant. There's also deflation. This is when inflation rates are negative, and although it sounds good, it's not exactly the greatest thing that you want to have. And we have disinflation. Now, disinflation means that there is still positive inflation rates. We're just growing at a slower rate than before.
Thank you, Kristine, for that extreme and aggressive review of inflation.
When discussing math related to GDP, we need to take into account two things. One, GDP always needs to be calculated at a constant price. And so in order to do so, we take into account a base year, which is a year which other GDP in certain years are based off of and compared to using a price index. Now, price index is a measurement that shows you the average price of a group of goods and how that changes over time. Now, whenever we're talking about real GDP, that is our GDP that is calculated for inflation. And so that is our current output times the base year prices. Right. And then whenever we're talking about nominal GDP, that is GDP that is not taking into account inflation. And so that is our current output times our current prices. And then whenever we're discussing GDP, we also have to take into account our price indices, which are GDP deflators. Now, our GDP deflator is used to take inflation out of GDP calculations, and that is whenever we do nominal divided by real times 100, and that will give us our GDP deflator. And then in addition, we also have our consumer price index, which calculates a market basket of consumer goods, and it's used to calculate inflation. And that is our that's a specific year's GDP. Wait, what is it?
It's
Specific.
it's GDP, yeah. I didn't
Yeah.
GDP.
It's a specific year's GDP divided by the base year's GDP times 100, and that calculates our inflation. And then we also have our inflation rate formula, which is basically the same thing. It is consumer price index of year 2 minus consumer price index of year 1 divided by consumer price index of year 1 times 100, and that gives us our inflation rate. Now, there are some differences between our consumer price index and the GDP deflator. Mostly that the GDP deflator only includes domestic goods and not anything that's imported, which is different from CPI, which includes anything bought by consumers from foreign goods, which include foreign goods. Yeah. Math.
Thank you, Zach, for teaching us math related to GDP. This has been Zach and Kristines Extreme Unit 2 Review.